The executioner had to rip off the bandage first. This wasn't just any condemned man. This was Maximilien Robespierre, the very arch-terror whose voice had sent thousands to the guillotine. Now, on the cusp of experiencing what his countless victims had felt, he faced a brutal twist of fate. His jaw was shattered. A blood-soaked bandage was the only thing holding the remnants of his face together, and it was directly in the way of the blade. What unfolded in those next 30 seconds would produce a sound that eyewitnesses, for the rest of their lives, would struggle to adequately describe. Here lies the chilling paradox of Robespierre. He wasn't a bloodthirsty tyrant who seized power through military might. He was a lawyer, a man so unyielding in his moral convictions that people nicknamed him the Incorruptible. He had even opposed the death penalty before the revolution began. Yet, this same man somehow came to preside over a killing machine that claimed over 20,000 lives in less than a year. By the summer of 1794, a single question haunted everyone in Paris. Not if the terror would end, but if they would survive long enough to see it. The revolutionary tribunals had already processed more than 200,000 suspects. The prisons of Paris were overflowing, with nearly 8,000 people crammed into cells, each breath held, each person awaiting the terrifying possibility of their name appearing on a list. June alone saw 1,300 executions, an average of over 40 people every single day. The guillotine had become so ceaselessly active that even the executioners themselves began to complain of sheer exhaustion. At the very heart of this relentless storm sat Robespierre, increasingly consumed by paranoia, increasingly isolated, and increasingly convinced that enemies surrounded him on every side. He wasn't entirely wrong about that last part. A dark conspiracy was already taking shape. In the next 48 hours, the man who had perfected the art of political death would find himself catastrophically positioned on the wrong side of his own terrifying machine. This is the story of how that happened. To truly grasp Robespierre's downfall, one must first understand the stark reality of France in June of 1794. The revolution was 5 years old. The king had been dead for 18 months, dispatched by the very guillotine that would soon claim Robespierre. Queen Marie Antoinette had followed him 9 months later. France found itself embroiled in war with virtually every major power: Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, the Dutch Republic. Armies pressed relentlessly on every border. Internally, the government had come to a chilling conclusion. The only path to survival lay in eliminating anyone who might harbor disloyalty.
The notorious Law of 22 Prairial, enacted on June 10, 1794, made this grim task easier than ever before. This single, devastating piece of legislation stripped away what little remained of judicial protection. There would be no more defense lawyers, no more witnesses for the accused. The very definition of an enemy of the people was expanded to encompass virtually any criticism of the government. Crucially, while this law was officially proposed by Georges Couthon, one of Robespierre's closest allies, everyone understood who truly orchestrated it. Robespierre had been advocating for precisely this kind of drastic measure for months. The consequences were immediate and staggering. Prison populations in Paris soared from around 7,000 at the end of April to nearly 8,000 by late July. The tribunals processed people with such alarming speed that the trials, if they could even be called, in France. For almost 6 weeks, between June 18th and July 26th, he was rarely seen in public. His health was visibly deteriorating. Those who encountered him described a man who looked frailer, more anxious, utterly consumed by suspicion. Part of this anxiety was, in fact, justified. There had been 2 assassination attempts in late May, one against his ally Collot d'Herbois on May 23rd, and another against Robespierre himself just 2 days later. But his withdrawal proved to be a catastrophic error. For while Robespierre hid away, his enemies were meticulously organizing. Let's be absolutely clear. The men who would ultimately bring down Robespierre were not heroes. Far from it. These were individuals with plenty of blood on their own hands, men who had participated enthusiastically in the very terror they now sought to end, sending hundreds, even thousands to their deaths. But now they were afraid. Jean-Lambert Tallien, once a loyal supporter of Robespierre, had made the grave mistake of falling in love with a woman named Teresa Cabarrus, who was now languishing in prison awaiting execution. He knew with chilling certainty that if Robespierre discovered the full extent of his moderation, his own head would be next. Joseph Fouché presented an entirely different case. He had survived previous purges through a potent blend of cunning and shamelessness, a combination that would cement his reputation as one of the most successful political survivors in French history. Fouché had been implicated in massacres at Lyon that even other revolutionaries found excessive. Now he was terrified that Robespierre was coming for him.
Jacques-Nicolas Billaud-Varenne and Jean-Marie Collot d'Herbois were both members of the Committee of Public Safety itself. They had clashed with Robespierre repeatedly over matters of policy and power. They understood, with brutal clarity, that in the zero-sum game of revolutionary politics, either they would destroy Robespierre or he would destroy them. And Paul Barras, a military commander who would later dominate French politics for a time, shrewdly observed the shifting political winds and began to position himself accordingly. These men, and others like them, began to meet in secret, whispering conspiratorially in corridors, cautiously sounding out potential allies. The conspiracy was growing, insidious and swift. And then Robespierre, with a chilling mixture of brilliance and self-destruction, did something that irrevocably sealed his own fate. On July 26th, or 8 Thermidor according to the revolutionary calendar, he finally returned to the convention. He hadn't been seen there in weeks, and every deputy in the room sensed that something profoundly significant was about to unfold. What followed was a 2-hour speech, described variously as passionate, paranoid, brilliant, and utterly suicidal. Robespierre stood before the assembly and, with simmering intensity, accused unnamed enemies of conspiracy against the Republic. He boldly claimed to possess a list of traitors, traitors not only within the convention itself, but also within the governing committees. Here's the critical, terrifying detail. He staunchly refused to name names. Consider for a moment what this meant to every single man sitting in that room. For months, people had been executed for far less than a vague accusation from Robespierre. Now, he stood before them, claiming to hold a list, yet he would not reveal who was on it. Every single deputy had to stare into the abyss of his own mortality, each one silently wondering, "Am I on that list?" Robespierre's own words from that speech perfectly encapsulated his precarious mindset. "I know that I am hated by the wicked. I know that calumny has already heaped its poison on my head. I know that the crimes of the conspirators are the cause." He spoke like a martyr, yes, but also undeniably like a man poised to unleash yet another purge. That very evening, Robespierre repeated his dramatic performance at the Jacobin Club, the political organization that had served as his unwavering power base throughout the revolution. Here he was among friends, and the applause was thunderous. His loyal supporters cheered every accusation, every veiled threat, every chilling hint of coming vengeance. But he made a fatal error. Amidst the adulation, he specifically criticized Billaud-Varenne and Collot d'Herbois by name. The reaction was immediate and violently hostile. Members of the club physically drove Billaud and Collot from the building. It was a public humiliation of the highest order, and it provided precisely the final push these conspirators needed. That night, the clandestine conspiracy shifted from mere planning to decisive action. They knew they had to move the very next day, July 27, 1794, 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, or they would never get another chance. This date would forever become synonymous with the end of the terror. The morning session of the convention on July 27th began with a speech from Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just. At just 26 years old, Saint-Just was Robespierre's closest political ally and one of the most feared men in all of France. They called him the Angel of Death for his chilling role in the purges and his icy, unyielding demeanor. His striking handsomeness only made him more unsettling. Witnesses often described him as looking like death itself, impeccably dressed for a grand ball. Saint-Just began to speak, but he would never finish. Tallien, fueled by a night of desperate plotting, leapt to his feet almost immediately. He shouted that Saint-Just had broken protocol by failing to show his speech to the committee in advance. Before anyone could truly respond, Billaud-Varenne launched into a full-blown assault, his voice ringing with accusations of Robespierre's conspiracy against the very convention they stood in. The session swiftly descended into utter chaos. Deputies who had spent years cowering in silent fear suddenly found their voices, emboldened by the conspirators' decisive action. Cries of "Down with the tyrant!" echoed thunderously through the hall. "Arrest him! Arrest him!" became a desperate, unifying chant. Robespierre, amidst the uproar, desperately tried to speak. He demanded the floor, his voice straining against the tide of shouts. But the president of the convention, a man named Thuriot, steadfastly refused to an unforgivable betrayal. Danton's trial had been a travesty, even by the lenient standards of the terror itself. When he tried to defend himself with his legendary oratorical power, the convention, at Robespierre's urging, passed a special decree specifically allowing the tribunal to silence defendants who insulted the court. He was executed on April 5th. According to contemporary witnesses, his last words to the executioner were chillingly defiant. "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." Now, 3 months later, that ghost came back to haunt Robespierre. The convention, seized by a sudden, collective courage, voted overwhelmingly for Robespierre's arrest. Not just him, but Saint-Just, Couthon, and Robespierre's younger brother, Augustin, were also condemned.
But this was where things became intensely complicated. France in 1794 was not a simple dictatorship where one vote ended everything. There were multiple, often competing centers of power, and Robespierre still commanded significant support. The Paris Commune, the city government, remained fiercely loyal to him. The National Guard commander, François Henriot, was also his staunch ally. When soldiers from the convention arrived to arrest Robespierre, the Commune brazenly refused to hand him over. Instead, they brought him to the Hôtel de Ville, the historic Paris City Hall, where loyalists were rapidly gathering to plan their resistance. For a few fraught hours, it looked as though this desperate power struggle might ignite a full-blown civil war. Within the revolution itself. Picture the chaotic scene at the Hôtel de Ville that night. Robespierre and his key As the night wore on, support for Robespierre melted away like snow under a harsh sun. Soldiers who had initially rallied to the Hôtel de Ville began slipping out into the concealing darkness, their initial fervor replaced by a palpable fear for their own lives. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the grand building that had seemed like an impregnable fortress just hours earlier was practically defenseless. At approximately 2:30 in the morning on July 28th, convention forces stormed the Hôtel de Ville. What exactly happened next has been fiercely debated by historians for over 2 centuries, shrouded in the chaos and conflicting accounts of the moment. Some accounts claim Robespierre attempted suicide, that he raised a pistol to his head but flinched at the last critical moment, succeeding only in shattering his own jaw. Other accounts contend he was shot by a gendarme named Charles-André Médat, who was either attempting to prevent Robespierre from killing himself or perhaps simply aiming to capture him alive for the ultimate spectacle of a public execution. The brutal physical result, however, was tragically the same either way. Robespierre lay bleeding on a table, most of his lower jaw completely destroyed, his once powerful ability to speak, the very weapon that had made him the most influential man in France, obliterated in an instant. Meanwhile, the scene around him was one of unbridled chaos and suffering. Augustin Robespierre, his younger brother, had either jumped or fallen from a window, brutally shattering both his legs. Couthon, already paralyzed from the waist down and confined to a wheelchair, was discovered at the bottom of a staircase, apparently thrown down by someone frantically fleeing the building. Philippe Lebas, another loyal ally, had successfully shot himself dead, choosing his own end. Saint-Just, characteristically, simply stood and calmly waited to be arrested, his composure unwavering. He had once written that those who make revolutions by halves dig their own graves. Now he was about to test that chilling theory firsthand. Robespierre was then carried to the Committee of Public Safety, the very body he had dominated for over a year. They laid him on a plank in the antechamber, and there he would spend his final agonizing hours. The wound was horrific. His jaw was essentially obliterated, crudely held together by whatever emergency bandaging the soldiers had managed to apply. He drifted in and out of consciousness.
When he was awake, he couldn't speak. The mouth that had ordered thousands of deaths was now capable of producing nothing more than guttural groans. At some point during the night, someone brought him water and paper. He was offered a chance to write, perhaps a final statement, perhaps just something to ease his obvious, immense agony. He managed only 2 words, later deciphered as possibly his name, or perhaps something else entirely. The paper was already stained with his own blood before he could finish. People came and went throughout the night and early morning. Some came to gloat, their faces twisted in grim satisfaction. Others came simply out of morbid curiosity to gawk at the fallen Titan. One woman reportedly spat on him, a raw expression of the hatred he had inspired. Still others simply stared, witnessing the horrifying spectacle of the man who, just 24 hours earlier, had been the most feared figure in all of France, now reduced to a silent, broken figure. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on July 28th, Robespierre and 21 others were brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Call this a trial if you wish, but it lasted only long enough to verify their identities. The law of 22nd Prairial, Robespierre's own chilling legislation, had already eliminated the need for actual proceedings. As outlaws, they possessed no right to defense, no right to call witnesses, no right to speak in their own favor. The very men who had meticulously crafted this ruthless system were now about to experience its unforgiving efficiency firsthand. Among those condemned alongside Robespierre was Saint-Just, who remained eerily composed to the very end, his handsome face betraying no emotion. Couthon, tragically, had to be carried in his wheelchair, a testament to his physical helplessness. And Henriot, the National Guard commander, whose drunken incompetence had so decisively helped doom them all, was also there, a shell of his former blustering self. The sentence, when it came, surprised no one: death by guillotine. They loaded the condemned men into 3 carts, known as tumbrils by the French, and began the solemn yet triumphant procession through Paris to the Place de la Révolution. The route was precisely the same one Robespierre himself had watched countless others travel before. The same cobbled streets, the same swelling crowds, the same grim destination where Louis XVI had died, where Marie Antoinette had died, where Danton had died. But the mood this time was dramatically different. The crowds were not silent or fearful. They were jubilant, almost delirious, with a raw, pent-up relief. People screamed curses, hurled garbage, and openly celebrated in the streets, their voices hoarse with a mixture of hatred and liberation. One woman, her face contorted with fury, pushed through the surging mob to get agonizingly close to Robespierre's cart.
According to the vivid accounts of eyewitnesses, she shrieked at him, her voice piercing the din. "Go now, evil one, go down into your grave loaded with the curses of the wives and mothers of France." Robespierre sat in the tumbril with his eyes closed, his face grotesquely swollen, the stark white bandage wrapped around his ruined jaw already soaked with fresh blood.
Whatever he was thinking, whatever he was feeling in those final, terrible moments, he could no longer express it, his voice forever silenced. The journey took about an hour. By the time they reached the scaffold, the crowd had swelled to truly enormous proportions. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to witness this historic moment. The executions proceeded in order, a grim, methodical rhythm. One by one, the condemned climbed the steps to the guillotine. Robespierre was the 10th. Despite everything, the shattered jaw, the night without sleep, the hours of immense agony, he climbed the scaffold steps without assistance. Whatever else one might say about the man, he maintained his stoic composure almost to the very end. The executioner was Charles-Henri Sanson, the same man who had executed Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and literally thousands of others. By this point, Sanson knew the guillotine better than anyone alive. He knew exactly how to position a condemned person for the quickest, cleanest death possible. But there was one final, gruesome problem. Robespierre's bandage was directly in the way. The thick cloth, wrapped so tightly around his ruined jaw, would prevent the blade from making a swift, clean cut. It absolutely had to come off. What Sanson did next would become the most remembered, most visceral moment of the entire execution. He reached down, his fingers firm, and grabbed the blood-soaked bandage. Then, with a sudden, decisive jerk, he ripped it away. The pain surely must have been beyond any human description. The bandage had been pressed against raw, shattered bone, against torn, exposed flesh, against sensitive, screaming nerves. Tearing it free was not just an act. It was like violently reopening the wound entirely, tearing away the fragile, crude repairs that had held his face together. Robespierre screamed. It was not a political statement, no final words of defiance, no grand revolutionary pronouncement. It was simply a raw, animalistic sound, a primal shriek of agony. Witnesses described it as the deep, sharp cry of a man in excruciating pain, the violent protest of a wounded human animal. The scream lasted only a moment, a gut-wrenching sound ripped from the depths of his being. Then, with a chilling thud, the blade fell.
The crowd erupted. 10 minutes of sustained, roaring cheering followed. People danced jubilantly in the streets around the scaffold, overcome by collective euphoria. After more than a year of unremitting terror, after thousands upon thousands of executions, after agonizing months of wondering if their own name would appear on the next death list, it was finally over. Sanson, following tradition, held up Robespierre's severed head for the public display. The face was barely recognizable, the lower half utterly destroyed and covered in blood. All trace of the precise, controlled lawyer, the incorruptible ideologue, was completely gone, replaced by a grotesque, mangled mask. The remaining executions continued, a morbid, methodical process. Saint-Just, Couthon, Augustin Robespierre, Henriot, and the others all followed their leader to the blade. By the time the grim work was finished, 22 men had died on the scaffold that afternoon. But it was Robespierre's death that people would forever remember, and specifically, they would remember that chilling, final scream. The executions didn't stop immediately. In the 3 days following 9 Thermidor, 104 more Robespierrists were
guillotined. The terror wasn't truly ending, it was merely changing targets, shifting its focus. This marked the guillotine as an instrument of revolutionary virtue, as a swift path to a purer republic, finally discovered what his countless victims had always known in their final, terrified moments. The blade doesn't care about your politics, your principles, or your impassioned speeches. It just falls. That final scream, that primal, guttural cry, that moment when the controlled, precise, and utterly incorruptible Robespierre was reduced to a wounded animal, has haunted descriptions of the revolution ever since. It was more than just the sound of a man in excruciating pain. It was the visceral, audible death rattle of an ideology that had devoured its own, a chilling testament to the horrific price of absolute virtue. The terror claimed over 20,000 lives, but one of them would forever become its face. Not just for what he engineered, but for the raw, agonizing way he fell. Robespierre's execution fundamentally changed France, shifting the trajectory of its tumultuous revolution. But what had happened just 4 months earlier, when Danton, that booming, vital force of nature, climbed those very same scaffold steps, had truly set everything in motion? And that earlier, equally tragic story unveils something even darker about the inherent capacity of revolutions to consume their most fervent children. The revolution did not immediately cease its grim harvest. While the guillotine's frenetic pace slowed, the immediate aftermath of Thermidor saw a period of retribution. The White Terror
Terror emerged, a brutal backlash against those associated with the Jacobin regime. But with Robespierre gone, the lethal. Yet even this new order proved fragile. Within 5 short years, the Directory itself would final, wrenching scream, that moment when the controlled, precise, utterly incorruptible Robespierre was stripped of all ideological pretense and reduced to a wounded, desperate animal, has resonated through history. It was the sound of an entire era's brutal logic reaching its apex and then collapsing, not with a grand pronouncement, but with a raw shriek of human pain. The terror claimed over 20,000 lives, but Robespierre's, in its tragic, bloody finality, would forever symbolize its grim legacy. His story offers us a chilling, practical lesson, one that echoes in the quiet corners of our own lives. It reminds us how easily noble ideals, when pursued with absolute, unyielding fanaticism, can curdle into monstrous realities. It teaches us the immense fragility of justice, how quickly systems designed for the common good can be twisted into instruments of oppression, and how vital it is to protect the basic human right to due process, even for those we revile. Most profoundly, perhaps, it reveals the enduring human tendency to let fear drive us to vengeance, igniting cycles of violence that ultimately consume even those who believe they can control its fire. For in the grand tapestry of history, just as in the everyday struggles of life, the blade, whether literal or metaphorical, eventually finds its way back to us all if we allow hatred and unchecked power to guide our hands.